They've removed one of those potential blows with the dam being gone, but there are still multiple options open for the Ukrainians. But the key thing, it seems to be, this Ukrainian main effort will be something to do with cutting the land bridge to isolate Crimea and make things more difficult for the Russians, because the ultimate theory of victory for the Ukrainians is that you wouldn't have to necessarily fight in Crimea, but the operational success by making potentially the Russian army wither on the vine and die leads to this situation rather like the 1905 and 1917 revolutions, where either an army walks off the battlefield or the Russians have a change of regime.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we're talking to a former British military advisor to Central Command. After 33 years service, Major General Chip Chapman has authored the book Notes on a Small Military and is a well-known commentator on geopolitics and security. General Chapman, great to have you on Frontline. Thank you very much for your time today. You're here to talk about Ukraine, and as its forces appear to be carrying out shaping operations as part of any counteroffensive, what exactly do you think they'll be looking to establish?
Well, you have to understand the framework of the battlefield to answer that question. And in terms of the battlefield, we look at deep operations, and that is the strikes to try and ensure that Russian combat power can't be brought to bear and to degrade its logistic sort of train. And that is exactly what the Russians are also trying to do on the other side to the Ukrainians. If you look at, for example, what the number of strikes in Kyiv, or attempted strikes in May, which was 20, that is trying to degrade the moral component of the Ukrainian people and to destroy their will to resist. I don't think that will be successful. That's what the deep battle sets out to do. What we're seeing the incipient parts of at the moment is the close battle. That's the contact battle between an offence which is taking place, not the offence. So the sort of small at scale at the moment, Ukrainian counterattacks in certainly in Bakhmut and towards Vuhledar. I think that uptick in offensive activity is being noted by US satellite activity. So you can say offensive operations are taking place at the moment. Whether that is the full frontal assault, we'll wait and see, because one of the things which led to success in 20th century warfare was reconnaissance pull. That is, that your offensive recce establishes the weak points which you need to then break through to have operational level maneuver. And the final part of the framework of the battlefield, which is relevant to the UK in particular and European NATO, is the rear area is where you seek to really have a respite in the sense of the framework of the battlefield at the moment. We are, of course, training in Operation Interflex along with 9 other nations, Ukrainian forces, 15,000 trained, and they don't have those psychological strains when they're in the UK as they would in the Ukraine. So that's how the framework of the battlefield works. I think largely the deep operations are over from the Ukrainian side. They'll continue to do that because you need to continue to sort of shape the battlefield. But it's that operational maneuver warfare, as we call it, which will ultimately lead, we hope, to what would be classified as winning big from the Ukrainian perspective. Winning big would be catastrophic success, either a collapse of the Russian army, a collapse of the will of the Russian people, that's unlikely at the moment, or the infighting in the Kremlin, because a decisive battlefield may not actually be the terrain of Ukraine, it may be in the Kremlin.
And put into all of that, the situation in the Kherson region at the moment after the explosions at the Kharkova Dam, desperate situations, accusations and counter-accusations as to who is responsible, how it could possibly have happened. Do you think we are now entering into a much more dangerous phase of the war where there will be attacks on increasing attacks on infrastructure and ones that infect the environment?
Well, that's a really interesting point, because if, for example, you look at Zelensky's 10-point peace plan, which he first illuminated at the G20 summit in November 22, point 8 of Zelensky's peace plan is the prevention of ecocide, that is the destruction of the natural environment by deliberate means. That is what we've seen, at least as the outcome of what's happened in Novakhovka. Regardless of who kind of did it, what we do know for certain is that there was a structural failure, whether that was from benign or deliberate neglect by the Russians, i.e. that's mismanagement, or whether it was by explosive means internally to the dam. We don't know yet. I think we will find out because one of the parts of intelligence which most people aren't aware of is a thing called MASINT, that's measurement and signature intelligence. So there are means to find out by that, along with, for example, SIGINT, signals intelligence, if the Russians were talking about this at the time of the attack. I don't think we're going to see more attacks on infrastructure in that sense. You could argue that the Russians tried that in 2022 on the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. And indeed, that was their deep battle. And now Ukraine has started to export electricity again. So they've survived that. That was really the three parts of what Putin tried to do in 2022 with the politics of energy, the politics of hunger with the grain deal, and that's relevant to one of the parts of the Nova Kakhovka Dam, which we can talk about. The other one was, of course, the politics of fear, which is still there in terms of any future escalation, particularly with the nuclear weapons and people's fear of that.
Yeah, you said we could talk about the effects on the grain. I mean, how serious do you think that this explosion is going to be on that production with ramifications for the rest of the world?
Well, what we do know is, of course, the agricultural sector will be affected by the flows of the water. We think that there are 400,000 hectares of arable land, the loss of irrigation to that land, and, of course, all the things which come from that, both in terms of employment and the lack of water in that area. So one of the sort of knock-ons really is we'll see refugee flows again, both from that area, either westwards, because there are people on the left bank and right bank who are affected by this. So some will probably go east, some will go west because they've got no other alternative depending on what splits the bank. Russia at the moment, the real knock-on is that Russia at the moment sees no prospect of an extension of the grain deal, which negotiations recommenced in the UN on the 9th of June. If the Ukrainian offensive is big in the next month and it delivers operational level success, and that could still be a lever that Russia uses for the future. The politics of grain could still be played in the future.
Back to what's been happening in the Kherson region, there are reports that Russia shelled those actually fleeing the flooding. Is this a sign that each side is prepared to take more desperate measures? Do you see it going that way?
Well, let's go back to the fact that the dam is down for the moment. If it was the Russians, and there's a high probability of that, that itself would be a war crime that would contravene Article 56 of Protocol 1 of the 1977 additional protocol to the 1977 Geneva Convention, which came in 1949, where dams, dikes and electrical stations, electricity generating stations, particularly nuclear power plants, are not to be made objects of war. Now, if you've already committed 81,000 war crimes, which is the number that the Russians have the last time I looked, you're probably not really that fussed about how many recorded genocides are there, and particularly if you've got a neo-imperial outlook. So that's the context that we need to look at this in. So the Russians haven't got a good attitude to how they treat their soldiers. Some of the soldiers may have been in trenches on low-lying ground and they didn't inform them. They've got no compassion in war, either for their own soldiers or for the Ukrainians. So we shouldn't necessarily be surprised by anything the Russians do. And that's one of the problems in trying to analyze them for the future in lots of ways, because, you're looking often through a rational Western perspective when this is a country which is different than us and often can think differently. And that is the real key problem of ultimately trying to analyze what Putin and his acolytes might do in the future.
A spokesman for the Ukrainian military says that the Russian troops were already retreating some 9 miles back from the Dnipro River before that dam explosion. What does that say about their intentions in this area? Are they abandoning it?
Well, they certainly would be now. So the timing, again, if the Russians did it, was it happenstance or deliberate? If they were already retreating, then that would be deliberate. Now, it wouldn't be the word retreating. So you have to understand the significance, I think, of what both sides really wish to do and where Kherson comes into play on that. So the Russians' main goal really is to prevent the retaking of Crimea. Kherson, of course, is the closest in geographical terms to Crimea. And if they could have got across the river and exploited in detail, and obviously a big river is often a problem in terms of sustaining your logistics for the future, then that would have been disastrous. So as that's one of the axes of approach that the Ukrainians could use, by making sure that the Ukrainians can't use that in the future, that releases your troops to be plugged elsewhere. And at the moment, the attack which is developing, whether that is the main effort of the Ukrainians or not, we don't know, around the area of Bakhmut and Vuhledar. And I think that will be a thrust ultimately south towards Mariupol to try and cut the land bridge to Crimea. But it makes sense from a Russian strategic perspective to release the troops who are really doing not much, but are in a holding position on Kherson because their offensive there petered out, and ultimately they wanted to go towards Odessa. That was never going to be sustainable. And so they made the decision, obviously, to pull back to the eastern side of the Dnipro River. So it makes sense now to release those men to go elsewhere where they think the main thrust will be of the Ukrainians in the future, because certainly in the short to medium term, it cannot be across that sort of Kherson area at the moment.
Let's just talk briefly about the nuclear power plant at Zaporizhzhia. We're told in the event of this explosion that there's no immediate danger in terms of cooling it with water, but there is potential for it to be used in another way, is there not? That it might be deliberately damaged to cause even greater destruction than we've seen at the dam. Do you see that as a possibility or a risk?
I would hope it's not a risk. And of course, there are international bodies and international monitors who are supposed to be there at the moment from the IAEA. But rather like the dam at the moment, there was damage to the dam as there has been damage to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So although the head of the IAEA has said that there's no immediate concerns, and of course the cooling ponds next to the site do have a water supply which is further upstream, as it were, from the dam, and the nuclear power plant is currently in a cold situation, it still does need water. So there is always the danger of something, a provocation, accidental damage being turned into deliberate damage in the way that this may have been something which occurred at the dam. And of course, the consequence of that, as we know, could be horrific if there was a meltdown and nuclear fallout started going. But of course, the direction of the wind also is a variable here, and Crimea, i.e., what Russia sees as its own territory and people, could be part of that. But it's also worth saying in terms of this battle for the narrative which we see going on, who did it and for what reason. It's the Russians, no, it's the Ukrainians. There was an op-ed in 1986 from TASS, which was in every newspaper in the former Soviet Union, saying that it was a provocation and nothing happened at a place called Chernobyl.
Indeed. Times reports say there have been sightings by Donetsk rebels of Leopard tanks near the Zaporizhzhia front, which comes alongside speculation that this could spearhead the Ukrainians' offensive. Do you see it that way, or are you more thinking that Bakhmut will be the focus?
No, I don't think Bakhmut will be the focus. Bakhmut might be the sort of anchor point when you go south. Bakhmut is only significant for its symbolic significance. It is not where the ultimate decision will be made. It's the area to the south. But one of the things the Ukrainians need to do is put the Russians on the horns of a dilemma. Where is the main blow to be delivered? They've removed one of those potential blows with the dam being gone, but there are still multiple options open for the Ukrainians. But the key thing, it seems to be, this Ukrainian main effort will be something to do with cutting the land bridge to isolate Crimea and make things more difficult for the Russians, because the ultimate theory of victory for the Ukrainians is that you wouldn't have to necessarily fight in Crimea, but the operational success by making potentially the Russian army wither on the vine and die leads to this situation rather like the 1905 and 17 revolutions, where either an army walks off the battlefield or the Russians have a change of regime. Now, a change of regime in Moscow does not necessarily mean that you're going to have a democratic liberal leader to begin with, but it might be that there is something there which leads to either some sort of form of negotiation, but at the same time it could lead to escalation, or it could lead again to a long game strategy from the Russians, and that is also one of the concerns. So all these things, there are no certainties, there are only scenarios, and anyone who thinks that they know what the linear outcome would be on this, where we go from point A to B to C to D, is kidding themselves in terms of how war being the greatest contest and the thing which you can never legislate for how things are going to go.
Yeah, you mentioned that potential for change of regime in Moscow more than once. How likely do you think that is? Because there are people who say very unlikely.
Yeah, I wouldn't give it a high probability terms at the moment. And we do look at probability yardsticks in looking at intelligence variables, really. So it is not highly likely. So not highly likely is way below 50% at the moment. And the notion, for example, that Putin would be assassinated, I don't think is likely at all at the moment, just because of the way that the organization which deals with his personal security works. That is outside of the major organs of the intelligence agencies in Russia, and you've got to get through that organization to get anywhere near him. But it's always been the case in any kind of revolution or change in Russia that some of the intelligence agencies in Russia have been involved. So that will be one to look for the future. But the variable at the moment of the three that I've said about, either the population just are fed up because things are going south, or there's elite defections, or the military. It's the military which is probably the weakest linchpin here, because if you've got a special military operation, which you're now into month 17, and you're not sure why you're fighting, and your morale is low, then things can quickly go south, and you can be in a situation where defeat does become catastrophic. We saw this really in 1917 with what was then termed the Kerensky offensive by the Germans. Where in 4 months, 2 million Russians just walked off the battlefield.
The timing of any counteroffensive by the Ukrainians, we've been told, is dependent on Ukraine feeling it has the necessary weapons and the necessary quantity of weapons that it needs. Are we seeing the kit getting through and the training up to speed?
I think we are. My one worry would be that the kit going to the Ukrainians has been a gradualist approach, and the final part of the gradualist approach from the things we always see going on at the Ramstein conferences is the move towards providing combat air power, particularly the F-16s. Now, again, in terms of the variables and things which led to success in 20th century warfare, the first one was control of the air. And of course, the Ukrainians don't have air superiority, and neither do they have guaranteed close air support. Neither do they have probably enough aircraft to do air interdiction. That is part of the deep battle. So that would worry me, because, of course, to breach, which they would have to go pretty deep in terms of recapturing lots of territory, the defensive lines, a number of defensive lines which the Russians have built, is not necessarily something that they can't do. If you don't cover an obstacle by either observation or fire, it merely remains an engineering challenge, which if you've got enough assets, enough air defense, enough Leopard tanks or other Western tanks, enough artillery, you can punch through. But the Russians still have, precision-guided munitions. They have anti-tank guided munitions. They still have air. They have loitering munitions. They have landmines covering those, and they still have plentiful artillery. So nothing is a given in war. It's still going to be, in terms of the close battle, all those things that we know about the nature of war being visceral, people get killed. It's a pretty horrific thing to be involved in. So to think that just by itself, deep maneuver and punching through the Russian lines and then using what we call the expanding torrent to fan out and cut the lines of communication, which often leads to this catastrophic collapse of the enemy force, that is not going to be done like a video game when no one gets killed. Lots of people are still going to get killed, I think.
There are reports that Australia is willing to donate F-18 Hornet fighter jets to Ukraine if the US gives its permission. That is reported to be a possibility. How much of a difference would these fighter jets make, do you think? And how
Well,
soon would they be available?
well, that's the key thing. They're not going to be available for this offensive because it's one thing to train a pilot, and of course you've already got lots of pilots who are trained. So the first thing, if you already had Ukrainian trained pilots, and they are trained in MiG-29s and various former Soviet planes, so just converting them in terms of flying an airframe could be done in 2 months. Fighting an airframe in terms of the weapon systems and all the avionics and things like that is a different order of kettle of fish, really. So it's not going to be probably in this fighting season. Now, that comes on to this thing about how long will this last. Now, both on the Western side, we have said we'll be supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. But also one of the theories, conversely, if you flip the coin on the other side of the Russian theory of victory, is that this is still an attritional kind of battle where ultimately military, economic and diplomatic activities to exhaust Ukraine and its Western backers will be used. And if they can't do that by conventional means in Ukraine, that's when the indirect approach comes into bear, the grey zone and all those things that people worry about undersea cables and cutting those in terms of the energy infrastructure in either the Baltics or the North Sea or those things. So there's still lots of variables and lots of scenarios about ways this could go. And that's why we talk about branches and sequels when we look at campaign planning, not linear projections from A to B to C to D.
What do you think Western authorities should be considering then? If you're talking about a prolonged war where we're all going to be affected in other ways, what kind of planning do you think should be going or is going on already in terms of contingency planning for this?
Well, we know that planning's going on, particularly in that sphere where NATO have a number of new committees in terms of the grey zone, looking at the protection of that sort of infrastructure that I mentioned in either the North Sea or the Baltic. But we also need to remember that from a Russian perspective, the West, NATO, America have crossed Russian red lines a number of times and nothing has happened. So I don't become one of these sort of maximalist people who kind of say, oh, we're going to go straight to the release of nuclear weapons. And I don't really think that's going to happen because what's really pertained at the moment is a mutual deterrence. Russia have had enough problems fighting Ukraine on its own. The reason that Russia has not attacked any of the lines of supply that come through NATO countries is that if that elicited an Article 5 response from NATO, I think Russia would be knocked out of Ukraine in pretty short order, particularly with American air power, which is just of a quantum of quality and quantity, which most people don't understand. If you then add in all the combined firepower of NATO, this thing would be over in pretty short order. So in terms of mutual deterrence, that has worked. That is also why Russia has done nothing, for example, with Finland joining NATO, which obviously shares a long land border with Russia. Neither is it doing anything at the moment for the accession of Sweden, which is likely to be in the next month or two, almost certainly, because it looks like being a deal to do with the PKK, which was the sticking point with the Swedish authorities between Sweden and Turkey.
If we could just focus for a moment on the partisan attacks that have been taking place by Russian fighters in Russia itself. Kyiv continues to deny any involvement in that around the Belgorod region. That's by the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Freedom for Russia Legion. Times reports say they could circle around the back of Russian army forces in Ukraine if they're pushed back by a Ukrainian advance. Do you think that's a possibility?
Well, the thing about partisan warfare is really that in the width and depth of the occupying force, as much as anything, it is to sow fear amongst people. Now, what's really happening, and this is the key thing again that most people don't understand about war, there's both a physical bit to it, people get killed, but there's a psychological bit to it, and it's the collapse of the psychological will to resist, either of a population or an army, which is the key thing. And it's these psychological ripples which have sort of happened in a way to both sides. That's, the draining thing that the Russians have done recently to the population of Kyiv in the missile attacks, which I mentioned. But it's the psychological ripples of these attacks which have happened in Russian territory, Russian sovereign territory, which brings a sort of lie to the myth that it is a special military operation. The fact that Russia has had to move people out of some of the border regions, and there have been attacks in Moscow. These incursions also show the vulnerability of the Russian defensive lines. So all this adds to the dilemma for the Russians. The partisan attacks, particularly in Belgorod, in a way, put them on the horns of that dilemma about, do they reinforce those areas with troops? What does this mean in terms of where they take them from? And it's those things that start degrading your force. It's also worth saying that when the war started, we used to talk at the time, or analysts used to talk at the time, of the war after the war. That is, that if Russia had succeeded quite quickly, that throughout that depth and breadth of Ukraine, there would be attacks on Russian people which would erode their will to resist in the same way that occurred in Afghanistan with the occupying Russian forces. And what we really say in all these things is that there can be an eroding stalemate. And in terms of Ukrainian armed forces are providing the power, the people are providing the will, and NATO is providing the training and support. If you degrade either the power of the Russians or the will of the Russians, then that leads to dilemmas for the elites of Russia, where this doesn't look like a special military operation. It looks like all-out war. And one of the things recently, certainly by Avril Haines, who's really primus inter pares in briefing President Biden in America, is that unless Russia can mobilize at least another 400,000 or 500,000 people and have a third-party supplier of weapons, it will not be able to do any major offensive operations in the future. And trying to mobilize that number of people without societal fractures in Russia is going to be extremely difficult for President Putin to pull off. And that is one of the dilemmas he faces at the moment.
So this eroding stalemate that you speak of, do you think that this is potentially the best way for Ukraine to secure victory?
It is. And one of the things about this is it actually comes quite quickly in the end. So you can never say it's going to happen tomorrow. But one of the things about authoritarian states is they always seem secure up until the moment that they're not. And we saw this in the late 80s in, for example, Romania with Ceausescu and other regimes when the sort of Berlin Wall was coming down. And that's exactly what happened in Afghanistan. The first use of that term that I came across was in 2019 in Afghanistan by the American analyst who used to report to the president. Of course, that's exactly what happened in 2021. So I do think the eroding stalemate is one of those things that can happen. But what I do hope will happen, the first one, is that there is a decisive military victory and that Ukraine win big. That is, that they recapture all their sovereign territory or the Russian troops leave. Winning small is also something that the Ukrainians could do this fighting season. That is, they capture some territory and not as much as they'd like. The worst option for them is if we don't have this eroding stalemate, but there is just a stalemate when people say, well, hang on, then nothing looks like it's happening. One side's there, the other side's there. Maybe we need to go to some negotiated peace. But a negotiated peace while the Russians still occupy at least for the oblasts and Crimea from 2014 is neither a just peace nor a better peace. It rewards the Russians as an aggressor, is against sort of international relations. And again, it's Kaja Kallas, the Estonian Prime Minister, who again best articulated this at the weekend in terms of her appearance at the Shangri-La dialogue, which is the one in Asian countries. And she said, at stake in Ukraine are the fundamental principles of the UN Charter and how international territorial integrity and sovereignty work, the right to exist as a country. For Russia, it is acceptable to conquer and colonize. And if you take the view that Russia is trying to do that and get rid of Ukraine as an identifiable country, then you're going to say that. And I'm of the view that that is actually what the Russians are trying to do.
As a veteran of the Falklands conflict, you know exactly what it's like to retake a territory. But for the Ukrainians, it's not an overseas territory. It's their homeland that they're fighting for. How much of a motivational difference does that give them? How much of an advantage does that give them?
It gives an incredible advantage. And indeed, from what I just said about Kaya Kala, you then go back to one of the anomalies in the UN Charter is under Article 2, brackets 4, close brackets. The UN doesn't really tell you or wants people to avoid going to war. It only gives two circumstances when you're permitted to go to war. The first one is when authorized by a UN Security Council resolution. And the second one is under Article 51, which is self-defense. Your territory has been attacked. Both in the Falklands and in Ukraine, sovereign territory has been attacked. And that is a motivator to go there and kick people out. It was a big motivator for the British forces in the way it should have been if you believed in the conflict for the Argentinians. We had a greater professionalism, greater will to win, and believed in what we're doing. And, will is one of those unquantifiable things, which is difficult to measure, but is absolutely a really key point when you're at war.
Major General Chip Chapman, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for your time today. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producer, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye-bye for now.